The courtroom was unnervingly silent. All eyes turned as the doors creaked open, revealing a tiny figure, a 5-year-old girl, Ava Mitchell. Her small hands clutched a leash, holding onto Titan, a German shepherd with a jagged scar along his side. Each step she took seemed to echo in the vast room, her little body stiff with fear, but fueled by quiet determination. Judge Henry Lawson watched closely. He had seen many cases, many witnesses, but never one like this. The weight of justice rested on this fragile child. Ava, the only person who could put a dangerous man behind bars. But there was a problem. Ava hadn't spoken a single word since the attack. Across the courtroom, Damian Pierce sat at the defense table. His expression was composed, almost smug. A 45-year-old software engineer, Pierce looked ordinary, too ordinary. But an eyewitness had placed him at the scene of Ava's attempted abduction. His lawyer had built a solid defense. No physical evidence, no confession, and a witness too traumatized to speak. Then something happened. Ava settled into the witness chair, her hazel eyes lifted, locking onto Damian Pierce's face. Her small fingers trembled, making a barely noticeable movement. It was subtle, but not to everyone. Titan saw it, and so did Judge Lawson. Titan's reaction was immediate. His body tensed, ears pricked forward. A low, menacing growl rumbled deep in his chest. His golden brown eyes locked onto Pierce, unwavering and filled with something primal. Recognition. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Spectators exchanged whispers. This wasn't just a trained support dog reacting to his handler's fear. This was something more. Judge Lawson slammed the gavel. The sharp crack echoed like thunder. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he declared, his voice firm but urgent. Olivia Reynolds, the prosecutor, shot him a questioning glance. But Lawson didn't meet her eyes. Instead, his gaze stayed on Ava, who clung to Titan like a lifeline. Something had shifted, something big. And before this trial continued, Judge Lawson needed to understand exactly what had just happened. Outside the courtroom, Ava knelt beside Titan, burying her fingers in his thick fur. She didn't cry. She didn't speak, but she pressed against him, holding on as if he were the only thing keeping her safe. The warmth of his body, the steady rise and fall of his breath, gave her the comfort no words could. Her mother, Laura Mitchell, crouched beside her, brushing back Ava's curly hair. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She wanted to scoop her daughter into her arms, to shield her from the horrors of the world. But she knew that right now Ava needed space, needed Titan. Ava didn't respond. She didn't need to. The way she gripped Titan said it all. Her small fingers curled into his fur as if she were anchoring herself to reality, to safety. Her tiny body trembled, but she refused to let go. Titan remained perfectly still, his deep brown eyes locked onto hers, as if silently telling her, "I'm here. I won't leave you." Nearby, Jack Callahan, the lead investigator, stood with his arms crossed, watching the scene with narrowed eyes. A grizzled FBI agent with decades of experience, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct he had screamed at him. "That dog knows something," he murmured to Judge Lawson, keeping his voice low. "Pierce must have crossed paths with him before. Dogs don't forget, especially not trained ones like Titan." Lawson exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "Then we need to find out where." Meanwhile, inside the defense's private room, Damian Pierce sat stiffly across from his attorney, Eric Langley. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. His earlier confidence had evaporated. He could still hear that dog's growl, low and menacing, echoing in his ears. His fingers tapped restlessly against the table, a steady rhythm of anxiety. He replayed the moment in his mind, over and over, searching for something, anything that could explain why Titan had reacted the way he did. The girl hadn't spoken, but the dog had. Pierce swallowed hard. His heart pounded in his chest. His pulse felt like a ticking time bomb, each beat reminding him that things were unraveling fast. The air in the room felt stifling. He loosened his tie, his breath coming faster than before. "She knows," he muttered under his breath. Langley frowned, shifting in his seat. "What?" Pierce forced a tight smile, shaking his head. "Nothing," he said quickly, but his mind was racing. That damn dog. He had thought he covered his tracks. He had been careful. He had planned for every possibility except this. He hadn't considered that the animal could be a problem. But now, as the walls seemed to inch closer and the sweat beaded on his forehead, he realized something that sent a chill down his spine. Titan might be the key to unraveling, suffocating him. He wiped his damp palms on his pants, his mind racing through every possibility. How much did that dog really know? And worse, how much did Ava remember? If Titan's reaction had planted doubt in the jury's mind, he was in trouble, big trouble. Langley was still staring at him, his attorney's sharp eyes scanning his face. "You're sweating," he noted. "What aren't you telling me?" Pierce forced a laugh, though it came out hollow. "Just nerves," he lied. "Courtroom tension." But inside, panic clawed at his throat. The walls weren't just closing in metaphorically anymore. He could feel them pressing down on him, and for the first time since his arrest, a terrifying thought crossed his mind. What if he didn't walk away from this? What if the dog had already sealed his fate? 15 minutes later, the courtroom filled once more. Ava walked in, still holding on to Titan. The little girl's grip on his leash was tight, her knuckles pale, but her expression was no longer just fear, it was determination. Titan moved beside her with unwavering focus, his muscles tense, his sharp eyes locked on Pierce. Judge Lawson's gaze flickered between the girl and the dog, his instincts telling him there was more to this than what had been presented in court. He cleared his throat, his voice steady. "Miss Reynolds, has this animal had any prior interaction with the defendant?" Olivia hesitated, her brows knitting together. "Not to my knowledge, Your Honor." Lawson turned his sharp gaze to Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, have you encountered this dog before?" For the first time, Pierce's carefully maintained composure cracked. His fingers, which had been drumming casually on the table before, clenched into a white-knuckled fist. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. A sudden thought struck Olivia, her breath catching in her throat. She leaned toward her co-counsel, whispering something in hushed urgency. Within seconds, an assistant bolted from the courtroom, disappearing through the heavy double doors. Langley, Pierce's attorney, stiffened. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. Olivia straightened, her expression unreadable, though there was a glint of something fierce in her eyes. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess. There may be new evidence that is crucial to this case." Judge Lawson's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, assessing. Then with a firm nod, he lifted his gavel. 15-minute recess. A wave of murmurs and hushed whispers swept through the courtroom like wildfire. Had Titan just recognized Damian Pierce? And if so, from where? Judge Lawson had the distinct feeling that the answer would change everything. That night, Olivia and Jack Callahan worked tirelessly, combing through every detail of the case. As the hours ticked by, their search led them down an unexpected path, one that sent chills through both of them. By morning, they were back in the courtroom, standing before Judge Lawson, their faces grave with what they had uncovered. "Your Honor," Olivia began, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of what she was about to reveal. "We have obtained new evidence linking the defendant to a previously unidentified crime scene, a remote cabin deep in the woods where missing children's belongings were found." A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. The weight of the revelation hit the spectators like a thunderclap. Jack stepped forward, his usual stoicism betrayed by the tension in his jaw. "Furthermore, we believe Titan encountered the defendant at that very location. His reaction in court was one of recognition, not just responding to Ava's fear, but because he remembered Pierce." A chill settled over the room. Judge Lawson's expression darkened. He leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled under his chin. "Are you requesting additional investigation time?" Olivia exchanged a glance with Jack before nodding. "Yes, Your Honor, and we firmly believe this evidence will dismantle the defendant's defense entirely." Langley, who had been sitting in rigid silence, finally turned toward his client, his voice sharp. "Damian, is there something you haven't told me?" Pierce didn't answer. His once steady hands were now visibly trembling. His pale face glistened with a cold sweat. His carefully built defense, his airtight alibi, it was all crumbling around him. Seconds ticked by, the silence stretching unbearably. Then, without warning, Pierce abruptly stood. He stopped himself, gripping the table for support. His breath came out in ragged gasps. His entire body trembled as though the walls were closing in on him. Langley turned, his face frozen in shock. "Wasn't listening anymore." "Damian," he could feel the weight of every eye in the room, every whispered breath, every silent accusation pressing against him like a tidal wave. The dog knew, the girl knew, and now, so did everyone else. "I want to change my plea," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely above a breath. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Spectators turned to one another in stunned disbelief. Judge Lawson's face remained unreadable, but a knowing glint flickered in his sharp blue eyes. He lifted his gavel once more and brought it down with a resounding crack against the bench. Motion granted. The trial had taken a shocking, unexpected turn, and all because of one silent witness, and a dog who never forgot a face. With Damian Pierce's sudden guilty plea, the case should have been closed. But FBI agent Jack Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. That night, he sat in his office staring at the case files. Titan's reaction in court hadn't just been about recognizing Pierce, it had been fear. And a dog like Titan didn't fear easily. Jack picked up the phone. "We need to search that cabin." The next morning, a team of officers and K-9 units arrived at their remote cabin deep in the woods. The place looked abandoned, but as soon as Titan stepped out of the car, his ears shot up. His nose twitched, sniffing the air. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, pulling on his leash. "He's on to something," Jack muttered. They followed Titan to the back of the cabin, where the dog began digging furiously at the dirt. After a few minutes, his paws hit something hard. A metal hatch, hidden under leaves and mud. Jack's blood ran cold. Inside was a small underground room, and on the walls, photos. Dozens of them. Children. All missing, all unsolved cases. Back at the police station, Pierce sat in the interrogation room, smirking. "You got me on Ava's case, that's it." Jack slammed the photos from the cabin on the table. "Then explain these." Pierce's smirk faded. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. Because these weren't just his victims. They were part of something much larger, a network, and Pierce was just one piece of the puzzle. Ava still hadn't spoken, but she clung to Titan like he was her guardian angel. And in a way, he was. That night as she slept, Titan's ears twitched. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Outside her window, a shadow moved. Someone was watching. Someone who knew Titan was the only witness left who could identify them. Titan's growl deepened as the shadow outside Ava's window lingered. The massive German shepherd didn't move from his spot beside Ava's bed, but every muscle in his body was tense, ready to attack. Ava stirred in her sleep, sensing Titan's unease. Her small hand reached out, fingers curling into his fur. The moment she touched him, Titan let out a sharp, warning bark, loud enough to make the shadow outside freeze. Down the hall, Ava's mother, Laura, jolted awake. "Ava!" she called, rushing to her daughter's room. By the time she flipped on the light, the shadow was gone. Only the rustling leaves outside remained. But Titan was still on high alert, his eyes locked on the window. Laura's blood ran cold. She knew that look. It was the same way Titan had stared at Damian Pierce in court. Someone had been watching her daughter, and Titan had recognized them. By morning, FBI agent Jack Callahan had ordered 24/7 surveillance on Ava's home. But it wasn't enough. "We need to move them," Jack told Judge Lawson. "If Pierce was part of something bigger, Ava and Titan are the only ones who can identify the others. They're not safe here." Within hours, Ava, Laura, and Titan were taken to a secluded safe house, a quiet cabin by a lake, far from the city. Ava still didn't speak, but she clung to Titan as they walked inside. The dog never left her side, his watchful eyes scanning every corner of the new place, as if making sure no danger could reach her. That night, as Ava slept, Titan lay at the foot of her bed, ears twitching at every sound. But for the first time in weeks, no shadows lurked outside. Meanwhile, investigators combed through the underground room beneath Pierce's cabin. Hidden in a locked drawer, they found a list: names, dates, and locations. More victims, more kidnappers. Jack's hands shook as he read the details. This wasn't just one man's crimes, it was a network, and Pierce had been just one piece of it. The most chilling part? Some of the children on the list were still alive, and Ava was the only one who had escaped. Days passed in the safe house. Ava played quietly with Titan, brushing his fur or tossing his favorite ball for him in the yard. Laura watched, heart aching, wishing her daughter would speak again. Then one evening, as Titan nuzzled Ava's hand, she did something unexpected, curled into Titan's fur. "Titan saved me." Tears filled Laura's eyes. She pulled her daughter into a tight hug, But Ava's gaze stayed fixed on Titan. The dog licked her cheek, as if understanding every word. With Ava's words, the FBI finally had a lead. "She remembers," Jack said, "and if she remembers, Titan remembers." Using Titan's tracking skills, they began retracing Ava's steps from the night she was taken. The dog led them to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place not on any of Pierce's records. Inside, they found more evidence, more photos, more names, and a chilling realization. The men involved had been watching Ava for months before they took her, which meant one thing. They knew where she lived. They knew about Titan, and they wouldn't stop until both were silenced. Back at the safe house, Titan suddenly stood, his body rigid. A low growl escaped his throat. Ava looked up. Titan! Then, bang! The front door burst open. A masked figure lunged inside. Titan didn't hesitate. With a ferocious snarl, he attacked. By the time backup arrived, the intruder was pinned beneath Titan's massive paws, whimpering in pain. The dog hadn't bitten him, but he hadn't let him move an inch either. Ava was safe, Laura was safe, and the last loose end of the kidnapping ring had been caught. As the police dragged the man away, Ava knelt beside Titan and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Good dog," she whispered. Titan licked her cheek, his tail wagging, because he had made a promise, and he would always keep her safe. Months later, Ava stood in a sunny field, laughing as Titan chased after a ball. Her voice, once silent, now filled the air with giggles and chatter. The nightmares were fading, the bad men were gone. And Titan, he never left her side. Because some bonds, some heroes, come on four legs.